My name is Emily. I'm in my mid-30s, and for most of my adult life, I've been the kind of person people describe as steady, dependable, quiet, the one who listens more than she speaks. I work in a professional environment where words like visibility and leadership presence are casually thrown around, but rarely offered to people like me. If you had asked my colleagues to describe me back then, they might have said I was competent, polite, maybe a little too reserved, someone who did her job well, didn't complain, didn't demand attention, easy to overlook, easy to underestimate. And for a long time, I let that be true. This isn't a story about revenge. It's not about shouting matches, dramatic walkouts, or exposing anyone in a public spectacle. I'm not proud of what happened, but I'm not ashamed either. This is a story about awareness, about what changes when you stop explaining yourself to people who benefit from misunderstanding you. At its center is a workplace I once believed in, a boss I trusted more than I should have, and a single moment when everything quietly reoriented. One file exposed a secret my boss tried to bury. It wasn't discovered in anger. It wasn't uncovered with intention. It appeared the way truth often does, accidentally, plainly, without ceremony. And when I understood what that file meant, I also understood something else. From that moment on, my job was no longer safe, not because I planned to do anything reckless, but because power, once seen clearly, rarely forgives the person who sees it. What follows is not a tale of instant courage or sudden transformation. There was no heroic speech, no dramatic confrontation in a glass-walled office. Instead, there was time, observation, silence, a recalibration of who I was willing to be. You'll hear about how small dismissals add up, how being the reliable one can slowly turn into being invisible, how staying calm can be mistaken for having no limits at all, and how quiet people, when pushed too far, don't always push back. They sometimes step aside and let consequences unfold on their own. I'm telling this story because I know how common it is, because many of you have likely felt that subtle pressure to stay agreeable, to not make things uncomfortable, to accept less than you deserve in exchange for stability. I'm not here to tell you what you should do. I'm only sharing what happened when I finally stopped doing what was expected of me. This story unfolds slowly, deliberately. There are no villains twirling mustaches, no sudden twists of fate, just people making choices and living inside the outcomes of those choices. So before we begin, I want to ask you something, not as a hook, not as a challenge, but as a genuine point of reflection. Have you ever sensed that something was wrong long before you had proof? And wondered what it would cost you to finally trust that feeling? To them, I was dependable in the way furniture is dependable. I was always there, unchanged, unobtrusive, doing exactly what was expected without needing acknowledgement. If a process broke, I fixed it. If a deadline slipped, I stayed late. If someone needed context, no one else had bothered to retain. My inbox quietly filled with requests phrased as favors but treated like obligations. No one ever asked how I managed to keep everything aligned. They just assumed I would. In meetings, I sat slightly off center, not at the head of the table, not quite against the wall, close enough to be useful, far enough to be ignored. When I spoke, people nodded, typed, and moved on. My ideas were rarely challenged. They were also rarely credited. Sometimes, 10 minutes later, someone else would repeat what I had said using different words, and the room would suddenly wake up. I learned early not to react. I wasn't junior. My title suggested authority, but titles only matter when people believe in them. I had been with the company long enough to know its rhythms, its weak points, the unspoken rules that govern promotions and protection. I knew which projects were quietly failing long before leadership admitted it. I knew which managers took credit for work they hadn't touched. And still, I was seen as support, helpful, calm, low risk. There's a particular kind of invisibility that comes from being good at your job without being loud about it. It's not dramatic. No one pushes you into a corner. They simply stop looking in your direction. You become the background system that everyone relies on, and no one thinks to thank. I told myself that was fine. I grew up believing that consistency mattered more than recognition, that if you did good work long enough, it would speak for itself. That integrity was a long game. So when my performance reviews came back with phrases like solid contributor or reliable presence, I nodded and smiled. Reliable is a word that sounds like safety until you realize it's also a ceiling. My boss liked to say I was low maintenance. He meant it as praise. What it really meant was that I didn't require managing, advocating for, or defending. I wasn't a problem to solve. I wasn't a voice to listen to. I was an asset that ran quietly in the background. At first, that felt like trust. Over time, it felt like erasure. I watched others advance not because they were better, but because they were louder, more visible, more willing to interrupt, to frame partial ideas as bold visions. I watched mistakes get reframed as learning moments when they belonged to the right people. I watched credit travel upward and sideways, never down, and I stayed still. Not because I lacked ambition, but because I believed restraint was strength. I believed patience was maturity. I believed that being steady would protect me. The truth is, no one was actively trying to diminish me in the beginning. That's the uncomfortable part. I wasn't targeted. I was categorized, placed gently, almost kindly, into a box labeled, "We'll handle it." Once you're there, people stop checking whether you want to be. I became the person whose calendar could be filled without asking, the one copied on emails when something went wrong, the one asked to just take a look at issues no one else wanted tied to their name. And because I was competent, I made it look easy. That's the danger of quiet capability. It creates the illusion that nothing is being taken from you. If you had asked me then whether I felt wronged, I would have said no. I would have told you I was fine. I liked my work, that I preferred substance over politics. And all of that was true until it wasn't enough anymore. Because beneath the calm, something else was forming. Not anger, not resentment, just awareness. A growing sense that the version of me they saw was incomplete and that they were benefiting from keeping it that way. At that stage, I didn't plan to change anything. I didn't even articulate the feeling clearly to myself. I simply noticed how easily people assumed I would absorb whatever weight they placed on me, and how little they noticed what that weight was doing. The first moment didn't announce itself as important. That's how these things usually begin. Not with something loud or undeniable, but with a detail small enough to be dismissed if you're not paying attention. If I'm honest, I almost dismissed it myself. It happened during a routine project review, the kind of meeting we'd held dozens of times before. Same room, same faces, same unspoken hierarchy in who spoke first and who summarized at the end. I had prepared more than usual for that meeting, not because anyone asked me to, but because I had noticed a pattern forming in the data, a subtle inefficiency that was going to cost us time and credibility if it wasn't addressed early. I didn't frame it dramatically. I never did. I laid it out clearly, supported by numbers, with a practical recommendation attached. When I finished, there was a pause. My boss nodded once, slowly as if he were considering whether what I'd said was worth carrying forward. Then he said, "Okay, let's table that for now." Table that. The meeting moved on. At first, I told myself it was reasonable. Agendas are crowded. Not every issue can be addressed immediately. But then, something else happened. About 15 minutes later, as the conversation drifted toward timelines and accountability, my boss brought up the same concern, not as a reference to my earlier point, not even as a paraphrase. He presented it as an observation he'd just had. I watched the room shift. People leaned in, questions were asked, notes were taken. Someone said, "That's a really good catch." No one looked at me. I didn't correct him. I didn't raise my hand and say, "Actually, that was mine." I told myself it wasn't worth derailing the discussion, that the outcome mattered more than the credit, that I was being overly sensitive. Still, something in me tightened. It wasn't jealousy. It wasn't even anger. It was the realization that my presence in that room was optional in a way his wasn't. That my contributions could be absorbed, reframed, and reissued without consequence. After the meeting, a colleague stopped by my desk and said, "Hey, good call on that issue. Glad it's finally getting attention." Finally, I smiled and thanked her. That night, I replayed the moment in my head, not obsessively, just enough to test whether it felt as insignificant as I wanted it to be. I asked myself whether I would have noticed if it had happened to someone else. The answer unsettled me. Yes, I would have. Because it wasn't just about credit, it was about authority, about who the room trusted to name a problem and who was expected to quietly solve it without acknowledgement. Over the next few weeks, small variations of that moment repeated themselves. A suggestion I made in passing resurfaced later as a directive. A concern I raised in writing was echoed verbally by someone else and treated as newly discovered. Each instance was subtle enough to deny intent, and that was the point. When patterns are small, they're easy to ignore, easy to excuse, easy to normalize. I told myself I was imagining things, that stress was making me interpret neutral behavior as dismissive, that my boss didn't mean anything by it. But there's a difference between being wrong once and being consistently bypassed. What stayed with me wasn't the action, it was the ease with which it happened, the comfort, the absence of hesitation, as if my voice was part of the environment, not the conversation. No one else reacted because no one else was losing anything. From the outside, nothing had changed. The project moved forward. The issue was addressed. The company benefited. Only one thing shifted, quietly inside me. I started to pay closer attention, not in a suspicious way, in a careful one. I noticed how often my boss spoke after I did, not before. How often decisions aligned with my earlier input, but were framed as his conclusions. How rarely my name appeared in follow-ups unless something had gone wrong. And I noticed something else too, how accustomed everyone was to this arrangement. That was the part that hurt more than the cut itself, because it meant this wasn't an accident. It was a role I had been playing without realizing it. One where my insight was welcome, but my presence as its source was not required. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't document it. Not yet. I just remembered it. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I marked the moment as important. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was the first time I understood that silence, when unchallenged, teaches people exactly how to treat you. After the first small cut, nothing exploded. That's how normalization works. It doesn't announce itself. It settles in quietly, reshaping your expectations one moment at a time until what once felt wrong begins to feel familiar. I told myself I was being professional, that I was choosing composure over ego. Every time a comment went unacknowledged, every time a contribution was absorbed without attribution, I reframed it as maturity, as a restraint. I became very good at explaining away my own discomfort. If my boss interrupted me, I assumed he was pressed for time. If he summarized my work without mentioning me, I told myself leadership was about outcomes, not credit. If my calendar was filled with tasks that weren't technically mine, I rationalized it as trust. There is a particular danger in being self-aware, but not self-protective. The behavior didn't escalate in obvious ways. It repeated. That repetition was what wore me down. It trained me to expect less, to anticipate dismissal before it happened, to soften my language preemptively so I wouldn't sound like I was claiming too much space. I started prefacing statements with phrases like, "This might not be important, but," or "just a small thought." Not because the ideas were small, but because I had learned that presenting them as such made them easier for others to accept. I watched myself shrink in real time and still told myself it was temporary. At one point, a junior colleague was assigned to lead a project I had designed from the ground up. He was capable enough, but inexperienced. I was told it made sense because he needed visibility. I was asked to support him. Support became a euphemism for execution. I coached him quietly, corrected errors before they reached leadership, rewrote sections of his deliverables so they wouldn't raise questions. In meetings, he spoke confidently about progress, and I sat beside him, nodding. When the project was praised, his name was mentioned. When issues arose, my inbox filled with follow-ups. I didn't object. I told myself I was being a team player, that this was how organizations worked, that pushing back would make me look difficult, that my reputation as calm and reliable was worth preserving. That reputation had become my cage. What troubled me most wasn't my boss's behavior. It was my own adaptation to it. How quickly I adjusted, How easily I absorbed the message that my role was to stabilize, not to advance. I stopped expecting fairness. I started optimizing for survival. And in doing so, I made myself even more useful. That's the paradox no one warns you about. When you tolerate being undervalued, you don't become invisible. You become indispensable in the worst possible way. You carry more quietly while others move forward unburdened. I could feel the resentment trying to form, and I worked hard to suppress it. I didn't want to become bitter. I didn't want to see malice where there might only be negligence. So I redirected the feeling inward. I asked myself what I could do better. How could we communicate more clearly? How could we align more effectively with leadership priorities? I took courses. I read books about influence and executive presence. I adjusted my posture in meetings, my tone, my email phrasing, and still the pattern held. The company praised values like transparency and respect, but those values were applied selectively. They flowed upward. They rarely flowed back down. The most unsettling realization came one afternoon when I caught myself hesitating to speak, even though I knew the answer. Not because I was unsure, but because I didn't want to watch someone else claim it moments later. That was the moment I understood how deeply the disrespect had been normalized. I had internalized it, anticipated it, adjusted my behavior to minimize its impact. That's when silence stopped being neutral. It became self-protective. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't document anything yet. But I began to separate myself emotionally from the version of the job I had once believed in. I did my work well, but I stopped offering more than was asked, not as a punishment, as a boundary I hadn't known I was allowed to have. I also began noticing how my boss reacted when I withdrew slightly. He didn't comment on it. He simply redistributed my initiative elsewhere, assigning visible pieces of my work to people who were more likely to showcase them. The message was clear, even if it was never spoken. Value was not about contribution. It was about presentation. I told myself I could endure it, that many people had it worse, that I was lucky to have stability, a paycheck, a seat at the table, even if it was at the edge. But something fundamental had shifted. I was no longer choosing silence because it felt right. I was choosing it because speaking no longer felt safe. And once you realize that, you can't unknow it. It took me longer than I'd like to admit to understand that the role I was playing hadn't been chosen for me all at once. It had been shaped slowly, quietly, through repetition. By the time I recognized it, everyone else already knew where I belonged. I was the one they turned to when something needed to be fixed without drawing attention. The one asked to clean up complex situations so leadership could present a simplified version upward. The one who absorbed confusion, conflict, and responsibility, and returned clarity without taking up space. Reliable, useful, invisible. Once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. In meetings, my boss often framed my involvement in careful, diminishing language. Emily's been helping out with this. Emily's been supporting behind the scenes, never leading, never driving, always assisting with something that was already supposedly in motion, even when the motion began with me. What struck me wasn't hostility, it was expectation. The assumption that I would be comfortable there, that I would not question why my role was consistently defined in relation to someone else's authority. I began to notice how tasks were distributed. High visibility initiatives went to those who spoke the loudest or aligned most closely with leadership's image of ambition. High risk, low recognition work found its way to me. I was trusted with complexity, but not with credit. That's a particular kind of contradiction. It tells you everything about how you're seen. My boss once said, in what he clearly thought was a compliment, "You're really good at handling things without making them a big deal." At the time, I smiled. Later, I realized what he meant. I made problems disappear without requiring acknowledgement, without escalating, without forcing anyone else to reckon with the work involved. I had been cast as the stabilizer, and stabilizers don't get promoted. They get relied on. There was an unspoken agreement in the way people interacted with me. They brought me problems, not possibilities. They asked for help, not opinions. They looped me in when something needed precision, not when something needed vision. When I tried to step outside that role, to propose a strategic shift or volunteer for something more visible, the response was polite but firm. "This might not be the best use of your strengths. We really need you where you are," where I was, as if the position had been fixed, as if I had reached the highest acceptable version of myself within that system. I told myself it was temporary, that once things stabilized, I could reposition, that my work would eventually speak loudly enough to be heard. But roles, once assigned, are difficult to renegotiate, especially if you've been playing them well. What made it harder was that I wasn't suffering in any obvious way. I wasn't being yelled at. I wasn't excluded entirely. I wasn't underperforming. On paper, everything looked fine. That's why it was so easy for others to overlook, and for me to doubt my own discomfort. But inside, I felt boxed in, not by rules, but by expectations, by the narrow way people imagined my contribution, by the quiet assumption that I would always prioritize harmony over advancement. And I had reinforced that assumption by doing exactly that. The realization wasn't angry, it was sobering. I saw that my boss didn't need to suppress me actively. He simply needed to keep me useful and content enough not to disrupt the structure that benefited him, and I had made that easy. The most painful part was acknowledging my own complicity, not in a self-blaming way, but in an honest one. I had mistaken endurance for strength. I had confused patience with progress. I wasn't trapped, but I was positioned. And positions can be dangerous when they're defined by everyone except the person occupying them. I didn't yet know how I would respond. I didn't even know whether I would. But for the first time, I stopped asking how to perform the role better. I started asking whether it was a role I wanted to keep playing at all. The shift didn't happen during a confrontation. There was no raised voice, no email copied to the wrong person, no moment where I finally said enough out loud. If you had been watching from the outside, you wouldn't have noticed anything different at all. That's what made it so decisive. It was a late afternoon, the kind where the office thins out early and the light through the windows feels more reflective than productive. I was wrapping up a routine task, closing out a set of operational reports that I'd been maintaining for years. It was quiet, almost peaceful. I wasn't upset. I wasn't looking for anything. I opened a shared folder I rarely needed to access directly. Not out of curiosity, but because a link in an old document pointed there. One click led to another. Subfolders opened. Files stacked in a way that suggested someone had reorganized them recently. That's when I saw it. The file name was unremarkable, vague enough to be overlooked. If you weren't familiar with the system or the history behind it, you would have scrolled past without a second thought. But I recognized the reference immediately. I opened it. What I found wasn't explosive. No scandal, no illegal activity, nothing that would make headlines or trigger alarms. What it contained was worse. It was a quiet record, a trail of decisions, revisions, and internal notes that told a story very different from the one leadership had been presenting. It showed that a failure, one that had been publicly attributed to process issues and quietly absorbed by my team, had been identified early. Identified, documented, and deliberately ignored by my boss. The file made it clear that he had known exactly where the problem originated, how it could be resolved, and what risks came with delaying action. It also showed that he had chosen not to escalate it, not because it wasn't serious, but because doing so would have reflected poorly on a decision he had personally championed. Instead, the fallout had been redirected, diffused, managed by me. I sat there longer than necessary, not in shock, but in recalibration. This wasn't about betrayal, it was about confirmation. The dynamic I had been sensing wasn't accidental. It wasn't miscommunication. It was structural. My role as the stabilizer wasn't just convenient, it was protective. For him, I didn't feel angry. That surprised me. What I felt was clarity, a clean, almost clinical understanding of the system I was operating within and my precise function inside it. And with that understanding came another realization, quieter but heavier. If I knew this, truly knew it, I could never unknow it. From that moment on, my job was no longer safe. Not because I intended to expose anything, not because I planned to confront him or escalate the issue, but because knowledge shifts power, even when it's kept private. The file existed. It was time-stamped. It was archived. It contradicted the narrative that had protected him and burdened others. And I was now someone who had seen it. I closed the file. I didn't download it. I didn't forward it. I didn't take notes. I simply sat there, listening to the quiet hum of the office, and let the implications settle. This wasn't leverage in the way people imagine leverage. It wasn't a weapon. It was awareness. And awareness changes how you move. For the rest of that day, I behaved exactly as I always had. I answered messages. I closed tasks. I said goodnight to the cleaning staff on my way out. No one noticed anything different. But internally, something had realigned. I stopped interpreting my boss's behavior as thoughtless or careless. I understood it as intentional, measured even. I saw how decisions were framed upward and downward, how accountability was managed like a resource. And I saw clearly how exposed I actually was. If that file disappeared, no one would ask questions. If responsibility continued to flow downward, no one would object. The system worked precisely because people like me made it work. And systems don't protect their stabilizers. They replace them. I didn't make any decisions that day. I didn't plan the next steps. I didn't even acknowledge the shift consciously. But when I left the building, I realized something fundamental had changed. I was no longer just enduring a role. I was now consciously inside it, and that meant I could choose how long I stayed. After that day, my silence changed texture. Before, it had been reactive, a way to avoid friction, to preserve balance, to keep things moving. Now, it was deliberate, measured, chosen. Nothing about my outward behavior shifted dramatically. I didn't become distant or cold. I didn't suddenly assert myself in meetings or withdraw from collaboration. If anything, I became more composed. That was the danger. People are comfortable with consistency. When you continue to perform as expected, they stop checking your motivations. They assume alignment. They mistake calm for compliance. And I let them. I listened more than I spoke, not because I felt small, but because listening gave me a fuller picture. I paid attention to how information moved, what was documented, what was verbal, what was conveniently left ambiguous. I noticed how my boss framed risk when speaking upward versus downward, how he used certainty with executives and caution with his team, how he relied on me to translate those shifts into workable outcomes without ever naming the inconsistency. I stopped offering unsolicited solutions. That was the first real change. I answered questions. I completed assignments, but I no longer preemptively fixed problems that hadn't yet been acknowledged. I waited to be asked. The effect was subtle but immediate. Small delays surfaced. Confusion lingered longer than usual. Nothing catastrophic, but enough to be noticed. No one traced it back to me. Why would they? I was still doing exactly what was requested. Silence, when chosen, becomes a form of positioning. I also became more precise in my communication. Where I had once softened language to protect egos, I now used neutral clarity. I documented decisions. I confirmed instructions in writing. I asked follow-up questions that required explicit answers, not accusatory, just exact. People began to respond differently, more carefully. My boss, in particular, started scanning my emails more closely. I could tell by the slight delay before his replies, by the way he mirrored my phrasing. He sensed something, not a threat, but a shift. And shifts make people uneasy. Still, he didn't confront me. He had no reason to. From his perspective, I was still reliable, still quiet, still useful. What he couldn't see was that my silence was no longer protecting the system. It was protecting me. I began to notice how often I had previously absorbed risk without acknowledgement, how frequently my name was omitted from decisions that depended on my work. Now, when something succeeds, I let it succeed without commentary. When something faltered, I let it surface naturally. This wasn't sabotage, it was a restraint. I wasn't withholding effort. I was withholding invisibility. And that distinction mattered. At night, I replayed scenarios, not out of fear, but out of preparation. I considered what would happen if the file I'd seen became relevant. I thought about timelines, documentation, and how narratives form when people are forced to explain decisions retroactively. I didn't save copies. I didn't take screenshots. I didn't need to. The power wasn't in possession, it was in comprehension. The more I observed, the more I understood that my boss's authority relied heavily on plausible deniability, on the idea that things had simply evolved a certain way. Those outcomes were unfortunate, but unavoidable. The file had shattered that illusion for me. And because I knew it existed, because I knew where it lived and what it contained, my presence in the organization quietly changed status. I was no longer just an employee. I was a variable. That realization didn't make me feel powerful. It made me careful. I thought about how easily people like me are removed when they become inconvenient. How often our restructuring and realignment used to clean up loose ends? I knew enough to understand that staying put without preparation would be naive. So I began preparing, not to attack, but to stabilize myself. I updated my records, organized my work, clarified my responsibilities in ways that left a paper trail. Not for confrontation, for continuity. If I left suddenly, I wanted it to be clear what had depended on me, not as a threat, as truth. My silence, once a habit, had become a stance, one that allowed me to see without being seen, to understand without reacting, to wait without fear. Others mistook it for the same old passivity. They didn't realize that silence, when it's no longer unconscious, is often the loudest signal of all. What they never noticed was how much I had always been watching, not in a suspicious way, in the way people do when they're responsible for making things work. When you're the one connecting systems, smoothing handoffs, translating intent into execution, you learn to see patterns whether you want to or not. Before, I had used that awareness to help. Now, I used it to understand. I began paying closer attention to timelines, how long decisions took to be acknowledged versus how long they took to be resolved. I noticed which delays were tolerated and which were escalated, which mistakes were framed as learning opportunities, and which were quietly assigned downstream. None of this required extra effort. It was all already in front of me. I had simply stopped filtering it through the assumption of goodwill. I noticed how often my boss relied on informal conversations to give direction, avoiding written confirmation when the stakes were high. I noticed how certain projects were shielded from scrutiny while others were over-documented. I noticed how risk flowed in one direction and credit in another. And I noticed something else: how much institutional memory lived with me. Processes I had designed years ago were still in use, though no one remembered who built them. Exceptions I had negotiated were treated as the default policy. Decisions I had helped shape were cited without context, as if they had emerged fully formed. I wasn't just executing the system, I was carrying it. That realization reframed everything. I started documenting, not aggressively, not obsessively, quietly, methodically. I organized emails, meeting notes, and decision logs the way I always had, but with greater intention. I labeled things clearly. I noted dates. I made sure context was preserved, not to build a case, to preserve reality. I also began mapping dependencies. Which teams relied on which processes, which deliverables require which approvals, where bottlenecks lived, and who they benefited. What emerged wasn't a conspiracy, it was a structure that functioned smoothly because certain people absorbed friction while others enjoyed clarity. People like me. As I became more aware of that structure, I adjusted how I moved within it. I stopped volunteering for work that wasn't visible or transferable. I asked clarifying questions when responsibilities were vague. I requested priorities in writing not as a challenge, but as a form of alignment. Each small adjustment shifted the weight back toward where it belonged. No one objected. Why would they? On the surface, I was being diligent, professional, thorough, but the system began to feel the difference. Projects slowed slightly, not because I was withholding effort, but because I was no longer compensating for ambiguity. Meetings ran longer because decisions had to be stated clearly. Follow-ups increased because assumptions could no longer hide behind my quiet execution. My boss started looping in others more often. He delegated pieces of my work to people who didn't yet understand the full context. Mistakes followed, not catastrophic ones, but enough to require explanation. Still, no one blamed me. That was the irony. By stepping back just enough to let the structure reveal itself, I made my absence noticeable without making my presence confrontational. What they never noticed was that I was learning just as much about myself as I was about them. I realized how deeply I had internalized the idea that stability was my responsibility, that it was my job to make things work, even when the design was flawed. Letting go of that belief was uncomfortable. It felt like negligence at first. Then it felt like honesty. I also began to see how power actually operates, not through force, but through narrative, through whom is believed, who is assumed to be competent, who is trusted to interpret events. The file I had found didn't just expose a past decision. It revealed how narratives are curated, how uncomfortable truths are softened, delayed, or buried, not through lies, but through selective emphasis. I didn't need to expose anything publicly to understand that. I simply needed to be patient. I started having quiet conversations, with myself mostly. I asked hard questions about what I wanted, what I was willing to tolerate, and how much of my identity I had tied to being the one who held things together. I also paid attention to how my boss watched me. It was subtle. A longer look when I spoke, a slight tightening when I asked for clarification, a new carefulness in how he referenced my work in group settings. He sensed that something had shifted, but he didn't know what. And not knowing makes people uneasy. I remained polite, consistent, calm. I didn't rush, because preparation isn't about speed, it's about timing. By the time anyone realized that I was no longer absorbing excess weight, it was already too late to quietly put it back on me. Systems had adjusted, dependencies had shifted, others had become responsible in ways they hadn't been before. And through it all, I never raised my voice. I never accused. I never revealed what I knew. I simply allowed the organization to operate without my silent compensation. That was the part no one noticed. And it was the part that changed everything. The reveal wasn't dramatic. There was no rush of adrenaline, no moment where everything suddenly made sense in a cinematic way. It arrived quietly, the way clarity often does, after you've already done most of the work to earn it. By that point, I wasn't looking for leverage. That's important to say. I wasn't digging. I wasn't hunting for mistakes or trying to catch anyone in something. What I was doing was understanding the landscape, how decisions were justified, how risk was distributed, and how accountability was quietly redirected. The file had been the catalyst, not the conclusion. Over time, patterns emerged that aligned too neatly to ignore. Certain initiatives stalled not because they were flawed, but because revisiting them would reopen questions leadership didn't want asked. Certain reports were summarized upward in ways that smoothed over early warnings, warnings that had come from me and from others like me. I began to see how narratives were constructed not by inventing facts, but by editing emphasis. What struck me most was how fragile that structure actually was. It depended on memory fading, on people moving on the assumption that no one would ever connect the dots, because doing so would require time, context, and a willingness to sit with discomfort. I had all three. One afternoon, while reviewing documentation for an unrelated task, I noticed a reference that linked back to the same decision chain as the original file. Different project, different year, same pattern. It wasn't wrongdoing, it was avoidance. Avoidance of escalation, avoidance of scrutiny, avoiding admitting that a strategic call had been flawed from the beginning. The implications were clear. My boss's authority wasn't built on certainty, it was built on managing perception. And perception collapses when timelines are aligned. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt grounded because leverage, real leverage, isn't about threats. It's about inevitability, about knowing that if certain questions are ever asked honestly, the answers will speak for themselves, and that knowledge changes how you breathe. I understood then that I was no longer operating at the same level of risk as before, not because I had protection, but because I had context, because I could see how easily responsibility could be redirected, and how important it was not to be the only one holding it. The private reveal wasn't about exposing him. It was about seeing myself clearly. I realized how carefully I had been positioned, not just as support, but as insulation. How my competence had been used to soften the impact of decisions I hadn't made. How my silence had allowed others to remain comfortable. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me precise. I stopped framing my future in terms of loyalty. I started framing it in terms of alignment. Was this system aligned with my values? Was my presence here reinforcing a structure I no longer believed in? And if not, what would it mean to step away cleanly? I didn't act immediately. I let the understanding settle. I observed how my boss behaved when under mild pressure, when deadlines tightened, when questions came from above, when narratives had to be defended rather than assumed. He became more careful, more controlled. He relied more heavily on ambiguity, and I saw clearly how dependent that ambiguity was on people like me not speaking too plainly. The leverage wasn't a file. It was my continued participation. And that was when the final layer of clarity arrived. I didn't need to confront him. I didn't need to escalate anything. I didn't need to reveal what I knew. All I needed to decide was whether I would continue making it easy for the system to function as it always had. The power wasn't in exposure, it was in withdrawal. That understanding was quiet, almost gentle, but it was irreversible. Once you see the structure clearly, you can't pretend your role in it is accidental. You have to choose. There comes a moment, not loud, not dramatic, when inaction becomes a decision in itself. I reached that moment quietly. For weeks after the private reveal, I lived in a kind of suspended clarity. I went to work. I did my job. I spoke when necessary and stayed silent when it served me. Outwardly, nothing changed. Inwardly, everything had already shifted. I knew too much to stay unconsciously loyal. But I also knew that acting impulsively would only recreate the imbalance I'd spent months understanding. So I sat with the options. I could confront my boss privately, present what I knew, frame it as concern, and hope for accountability. That path depended on goodwill, on the assumption that someone who had avoided scrutiny would welcome it when offered calmly. I no longer believed that. I could escalate formally, go to HR, compliance, leadership. That path would create noise. Documentation would be reviewed, narratives would collide, and regardless of outcome, I would be marked, not as brave, as inconvenient. I could also do nothing, stay in place, continue absorbing friction, let the structure hold as it always had. That option was the safest in the short term and the most expensive in the long term. The final option was the least obvious. I could remove myself, not in protest, not in anger, but in alignment. The more I examined that option, the clearer it became. Leaving wasn't an escape, it was a rebalancing. The system relied on my quiet compensation. Without it, things would surface naturally, not as accusations, as consequences. That path didn't require me to expose anyone. It didn't demand confrontation or validation. It simply required me to stop participating in a dynamic that no longer respected me. Still, the decision wasn't easy. I had invested years here. I had relationships, routines, and a reputation built on reliability. Walking away meant relinquishing control over how my story would be told. People might assume I couldn't handle pressure, or that I was passed over, or that I left for personal reasons unrelated to the structure I'd come to understand. And I had to be okay with that, because justice, I was learning, doesn't always look like being believed. Sometimes it looks like being free. The final decision came one evening as I sat reviewing my notes, not about the file, but about myself, about how much of my identity had been shaped by being the one who held things together. How rarely I had asked whether holding things together was my responsibility in the first place. I realized that staying would require me to keep pretending I didn't see what I now saw clearly, and I wasn't willing to do that anymore. So I chose the irreversible option. Not resignation, not yet. Preparation. I updated my resume. Quietly, carefully, I reconnected with contacts I trusted, not to vent, but to understand the landscape beyond my current role. I assessed my finances, my obligations, and my timeline. I also tightened my work boundaries further. I clarified deliverables. I ensured transitions were documented. I reduced my exposure to unacknowledged risk. My boss noticed. He began asking questions framed as concern. Everything okay? You seem a bit more reserved lately. I smiled and assured him I was fine. Because I was. For the first time in a long time, my calm wasn't a performance. It was alignment. The decision had already been made internally. The rest was execution. I wasn't leaving to punish anyone. I wasn't leaving to make a point. I was leaving because staying would require me to betray my own clarity. And once you reach that point, there's no negotiation left to do. Once the decision was made, everything slowed down, not externally, internally. I wasn't rushing anymore. I wasn't counting days or imagining exit speeches. I was simply moving, quietly, deliberately, through the steps I already knew were necessary. That's the thing about real decisions. They don't create urgency. They create focus. I didn't announce anything. I didn't hint. I didn't change my tone or my demeanor. If anything, I became even more consistent, predictable, calm, unremarkable. People assume silence means nothing is happening. They rarely consider that it might mean everything is already in motion. I began with structure. I reviewed my responsibilities and documented them cleanly, not as a handover, but as a professional baseline. I clarified which decisions required my input and which didn't. I stopped absorbing ambiguity on behalf of others. When something wasn't clear, I asked for clarification in writing. When priorities conflicted, I asked which one should come first. Not defensively, just precisely. This had an effect. Decisions that had once floated now had to land somewhere. Assumptions had to be stated. Ownership had to be named. The system resisted at first, not openly, but through friction, small delays, longer meetings, follow-up questions that had never been necessary before. Still, no one blamed me because I wasn't doing less. I was doing exactly what was asked. At the same time, I began preparing outside the organization. Quiet conversations, informational interviews, a careful survey of what my experience was actually worth in environments that didn't rely on my invisibility. What surprised me wasn't how ready others were to listen. It was how clearly I could now articulate my value. Once I stopped minimizing it, I spoke plainly about my work, about the systems I had built, the risks I had managed, the complexity I had held without recognition, not as a complaint, as a fact. And people responded to facts. Back at work, my boss grew more attentive. He looped me into conversations he hadn't before. He asked for my opinion more directly. He even credited me once, publicly, for a process improvement. It might have felt like progress. It wasn't. It was containment. I recognized the shift immediately. When systems sense instability, they try to stabilize. When people sense loss, they attempt repair, not always with honesty, but with gestures. I accepted the gestures politely. I didn't push back. I didn't lean in, because repair without reckoning is just a delay. The file I had found remained untouched. I didn't revisit it. I didn't need to. Its existence had already done its work internally. I was no longer moving from fear or hope. I was moving from clarity. Weeks passed, then months. From the outside, it looked like a steady period. No drama, no upheaval, no warning signs. That was the point. I wanted my departure, when it came, to be undeniable but not explosive, to be understood as a fact, not a threat. In quiet moments, I imagined how things would feel without me there, not emotionally, logistically, where questions would land, how would slow, what assumptions would finally be tested, not with satisfaction, with neutrality. Because when you've been the invisible stabilizer long enough, you stop needing validation. You know exactly what you've been carrying, and you know what will happen when you set it down. I didn't owe anyone an explanation yet. I didn't owe anyone loyalty at the cost of my integrity. So I kept moving, silently. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They rarely do. They surfaced the way structural weaknesses always surface, gradually, unevenly, and without a clear origin point. No alarms, no announcements, just a growing sense that things were off. At first, it was small. A deadline slipped because someone misunderstood a dependency I used to manage implicitly. A meeting ended without resolution because no one was quite sure who had final authority. An email thread grew longer than necessary because context was missing, and no one knew where to find it. People adapted. They always do. But adaptation takes energy. I noticed it in the way conversations changed. More follow-ups, more clarification requests, more visible uncertainty. Nothing that could be blamed on a single person. Certainly not on me. After all, I was still there, still answering questions, still delivering what I was assigned, still calm. But I was no longer compensating for gaps no one else wanted to name. My boss began to feel it next. He started checking in more frequently, not with me, but around me, looping in additional stakeholders, adding layers of review, trying to recreate the sense of control that had once come effortlessly. What he didn't realize was that control had never been effortless. It had just been quietly maintained. I watched as small issues began traveling upward instead of dissolving quietly at my level. Executives asked questions that required explanation, not reassurance. Decisions that had once been waved through now needed justification. The narrative was still intact, but it was thinning. People started saying things like, "This feels more complicated than it used to," or, "I don't remember this being such a heavy lift." I did. I remembered exactly how much weight had been carried without comment. No one accused me of withholding support. That would have required acknowledging how much support I'd been providing in the first place. Instead, there was confusion, discomfort, a subtle sense of loss without a name. That's the strange thing about invisible labor. When it stops, the absence is felt, but rarely attributed correctly. Colleagues began stepping into roles they hadn't anticipated. Some struggled, some rose to the challenge. Either way, the system adjusted, but not without cost. And that cost showed up in places leadership couldn't ignore. My boss's tone shifted, less confident, more cautious. He asked more questions before committing. He avoided firm statements when speaking upward. The certainty he once projected had relied on a buffer. That buffer was gone. Still, no one confronted me. There was nothing to confront. I was doing my job, no more, no less. And that was precisely the problem. I realized then how much of my value had been measured not by contribution, but by absorption, by how much friction I removed from the system without asking anything in return. Once that absorption stopped, the system had to face itself quietly. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt steady because this wasn't chaos. It was a correction. And correction, while uncomfortable, is not cruel. There were moments when I could see the realization flicker across my boss's face that something had changed and he wasn't sure how to restore it. That whatever equilibrium he had relied on was no longer holding. He didn't know where to place that realization. He certainly didn't place it on me. That's the irony of quiet dominance. When you step back without spectacle, people feel the impact before they understand the cause. And by the time they start asking the right questions, the answers no longer matter because the system has already begun to shift. By the time anyone tried to fix what was happening, the window had already closed. Not because I was uncooperative, not because I refused to help, but because the nature of the problem had finally changed, and so had my position within it. The first real sign of panic didn't come from my boss directly. It came from the system around him. Suddenly, meetings appeared on calendars with vague titles: alignment check, process review, operational sync. People who had never needed my input before were now asking for context, not casually, carefully. They weren't looking for solutions. They were looking for reassurance. My boss's tone shifted again. Where it had once been confident, then cautious, it now carried something else: urgency, disguised as collaboration. He began asking questions that reached backward instead of forward. How did we used to handle this? Do you remember why this was set up that way? What's the original rationale here? Questions that only matter when the present is no longer holding. I answered them honestly, briefly, without filling in the gaps for him. That was the difference. Before, I would have connected the dots automatically, offered background, anticipated follow-ups, smoothed the edges so the explanation sounded cohesive. Now, I responded exactly to what was asked. No more, no less. And that restraint exposed how dependent the system had been on my interpretive labor, on my ability to translate complexity into confidence for others. The more leadership tried to fix things, the more obvious it became that there was no single fix to apply. What had been lost wasn't a process. It was an unacknowledged role, and roles can't be patched retroactively. My boss finally asked to meet one-on-one, not to confront me, to reconnect. He spoke about growth, about opportunity, about how much he valued my steadiness during a challenging period. He mentioned future possibilities, roles that hadn't existed before, paths that might open up if we could just stabilize things. It was all framed as concern, but I heard the subtext clearly. Stay. I listened. I nodded. I thanked him for the conversation, and I didn't commit to anything. That's when I knew it was too late, because what he was offering wasn't change, it was retention, an attempt to restore balance without examining what had thrown it off. And balance built on invisibility is not balance at all. After that meeting, his behavior shifted again. He became more careful around me, more deferential in public, almost deferential enough to be noticeable. But respect offered in hindsight is rarely about respect. It's about fear of loss, and fear doesn't rebuild trust. By then, I had already begun disengaging internally, not emotionally, structurally. I had separated my identity from the role. I no longer needed the organization to validate what I knew about my work. The irony was that, as things unraveled, my value became more visible than it had ever been. Too visible. People began acknowledging, indirectly, how much I had been holding together. Comments like, "I didn't realize how much you were managing," or, "We're still figuring out how to replace that process." Replace, not recognize. That distinction mattered. If the system had truly seen me, it wouldn't be scrambling now. It would have adjusted earlier, when adjustment was still possible without damage. But systems rarely change until the cost becomes undeniable, and by then, the people who paid that cost quietly are often already gone. In every way that matters. I wasn't angry. I wasn't vindicated. I was finished. The attempt to fix things came too late. Not because I refused it, but because I no longer believed in the structure offering it. And belief, once withdrawn, doesn't return on demand. The confrontation, when it finally happened, was almost disappointing in its ordinariness. No raised voices, no accusations, No dramatic reveals, just two people sitting across from each other in a quiet room, speaking carefully as if volume might tip something fragile over the edge. My boss asked for the meeting under the pretense of closure. He didn't say the word confrontation, but it hovered between us anyway. By then, the atmosphere had shifted enough that neither of us could pretend that nothing was wrong. He started by thanking me. That was new. He spoke about my contributions, my consistency, and how much the team had relied on me. He acknowledged that the last few months had been challenging and suggested that perhaps communication hadn't always been clear. It was the closest he came to an apology. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, he paused, waiting for reassurance, I think, waiting for me to soften the moment the way I always had, to say it was fine, that we were all doing our best. I didn't. Instead, I said something simple. I've been very clear, I told him, about what I'm responsible for and what I'm not. My voice didn't shake. It didn't need to. He nodded slowly. Of course, I just want to make sure we're aligned. Alignment. That word again. I met his eyes and said, I don't think alignment is the issue. There was a brief silence, not uncomfortable, just unfamiliar. The kind that happens when the usual script stops working. He asked if there was something specific I wanted to address. This was the moment people imagined as the reveal, the point where I might mention the file or list grievances, or finally explain everything I'd seen and understood. I didn't do any of that because I wasn't there to convince him of anything. I've adjusted how I work, I said, to match how decisions are actually made. That was it. No elaboration. He frowned slightly, processing. I'm not sure I follow. I know, I said, and I meant it. That was the entire confrontation. No heat, no moralizing, no attempt to be understood. What mattered wasn't whether he grasped my meaning. It was that I no longer needed him to. The power dynamic shifted in that moment. Not because I asserted dominance, but because I withdrew explanation. I didn't offer my insight as a gift anymore. I didn't translate reality into something more comfortable for him. I left the meeting calmly, professionally, and I knew, without doubt, that whatever he might say to others afterward would not change the outcome, because outcomes are shaped by actions, not conversations. He never mentioned the file. I never mentioned it either. We both understood, in our own ways, that some knowledge doesn't need to be spoken to exert pressure. The absence of heat was the point. Anger invites defense. Calm invites reckoning. And reckoning, when it comes too late, has nothing left to negotiate with. That conversation didn't end things. It clarified them. When I think about who I am now, the difference isn't loud. It isn't a new title or a dramatic reinvention. It's quieter than that, more internal, more stable. I'm no longer the person who confuses endurance with virtue. For a long time, I believed that staying calm, staying useful, staying agreeable was a form of strength. And in some contexts, it is. But when those qualities are exploited rather than respected, they become liabilities disguised as virtues. I understand that now. What changed wasn't my temperament. I didn't become harder or colder. I became clearer. Clearer about where my responsibility ends. Clearer about what I owe and what I don't. I no longer volunteer my energy into systems that depend on my silence to function. I no longer smooth over discomfort that belongs to someone else. and I no longer mistake being needed for being valued. That distinction reshaped everything. I still work carefully. I still listen more than I speak. I still prefer precision over spectacle. But I no longer shrink to fit expectations that were never negotiated with me. I choose my silence now, and that choice makes it powerful rather than passive. I also learned that justice doesn't always look like exposure. Sometimes it looks like a refusal to continue participating in a structure that benefits from your invisibility. Refusal to keep explaining yourself to people who only listen when it's convenient. Walking away, internally first, then structurally, was not an act of bitterness. It was an act of self-respect. I don't speak badly about my former boss. I don't need to. The system he maintained continues to operate without the buffer it once relied on. Outcomes speak in ways accusations never could. As for me, I carry forward something far more valuable than vindication. I carry discernment. I know now how to recognize when calm is being mistaken for compliance, when reliability is being used as a ceiling effect, when praise is offered as a substitute for change. And I trust myself enough to respond accordingly. There is no anger in this story, no desire to humiliate or expose, only the quiet satisfaction of knowing that I no longer abandon myself to keep others comfortable. That to me is dominance, not over people, but over my own participation. I am still quiet, but I am not invisible. If there's one thing this experience taught me, it's that power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it hides in habits, in roles that feel familiar, in expectations that are never stated out loud, but are enforced all the same. For a long time, I thought staying calm was the same as staying in control. I thought being indispensable meant being secure. I thought that if I kept my head down and my work solid, fairness would eventually find me. What I learned is quieter and harder to accept. Systems don't change because someone is patient. They change because the conditions that allow them to stay comfortable disappear. No one I worked with was overtly cruel. No one set out to harm me. And that's exactly why it took so long to see what was happening. Harm doesn't always come from malice. Often it comes from convenience, from allowing the same person to absorb strain again and again because they don't complain. The moment I stopped absorbing that strain, the truth surfaced on its own, not as a scandal, as a consequence. I didn't need to expose anyone. I didn't need to raise my voice or prove my worth. I simply needed to stop offering my silence as a resource. And that's the part I hope stays with you. If you are quiet, that doesn't make you weak. If you are steady, that doesn't make you expendable. But if your calm is being used to hold together something that consistently overlooks you, it's worth asking who that calm is really serving. There is a difference between being kind and being invisible, between being patient and being erased. Learning to tell that difference changed my life. I'm not telling this story so you'll walk away from your job or confront someone tomorrow or search for hidden files. That's not the point. The point is awareness. When you become aware of how a system truly works and where you fit inside it, you regain choice. And choice, even when exercised quietly, is powerful. Sometimes the most meaningful form of justice isn't exposure, it's alignment. So I'll leave you with this question, and I genuinely love to read your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever realized, maybe slowly, maybe all at once, that your silence was holding something together, and wondered what might happen if you finally set that weight down?